Imagine walking not on pavement, but on the ancient stone causeways of a city teeming with life, the air thick with the scent of copal incense and damp earth. You are in the heart of the Maya civilization, a world not of ruins but of vibrant, terrifying power. Towering pyramids pierce the jungle canopy, their stone faces carved with the visages of gods who demand blood, and kings who claim kinship with the divine. In this world, some women are not just revered, they are considered sacred, living conduits to the supernatural, vessels of cosmic power whose purity dictates the fate of the empire. But what happens when a vessel is deemed impure? What happens when a sacred woman breaks the covenant that binds her to the gods and the state? The answer is not just punishment. It is a form of ritualized brutality so horrific it makes the mind recoil, a spectacle designed to restore cosmic balance and etch the warning into the very soul of society. Before we descend into the shadows of Maya justice, if you find yourself captivated by the forgotten truths that history tried to bury, consider hitting that like button and subscribing. Your curiosity fuels this journey into the past, and please comment below and let me know where in the world you're joining this exploration from. It's a powerful thought that we can connect across continents and centuries, united by a shared fascination with the stories that shaped humanity. What you are about to hear is not a simple tale of crime and punishment. It is an exploration of how a civilization's deepest beliefs, its reverence for the sacred feminine, its obsession with cosmic order, and its terror of divine wrath, could give birth to acts of unimaginable cruelty. This is the story of how a society that elevated women to the status of goddesses could, in the blink of an eye, subject them to a fate worse than any common criminal could ever imagine. Let's first understand who these women were. They weren't just priestesses in the modern sense. In the complex tapestry of Maya society, a sacred woman could be a royal wife, whose bloodline was the key to dynastic legitimacy. She was the mother of future kings, and her body was seen as the literal cradle of the dynasty's divine right to rule. Her every action, from the rituals she performed to the children she bore, was a matter of state security and cosmic importance. To threaten her was to threaten the king, and by extension, the stability of the entire kingdom. Others were chosen as oracles, women believed to possess the ability to communicate directly with the gods, their voices channeling prophecies that could decide the fate of harvests, wars, and entire cities. They lived in a liminal space, caught between the mortal world and the divine, their bodies no longer truly their own, but instruments of a higher power. Imagine the immense pressure, the constant scrutiny. Every word they spoke was dissected for hidden meaning. Every dream analysed for divine portents. Their lives were a performance of piety, a constant draining ritual of purity and devotion. Then there were the temple virgins, young women dedicated from childhood to the service of specific deities, most often the moon goddess Ixchel. They were the keepers of the sacred fires, the weavers of ceremonial textiles, the guardians of ancient knowledge passed down through generations. Their virginity was not merely a symbol of purity, it was considered a source of immense spiritual power, a form of contained energy that, if properly harnessed, could nourish the gods and protect the community. Their bodies were seen as sacred ground, a microcosm of the ordered universe. To defile such a woman was not just a personal violation, it was an act of cosmic vandalism. It was to spit in the face of the gods, to invite chaos and divine retribution upon the entire community. The Maya believed the universe was a precarious balance of forces, creation and destruction, order and chaos, life and death. Human actions, especially the actions of those closest to the gods, could tip this balance. A sacred woman's transgression, therefore, was not a private misstep. It was a cosmic disturbance, a crack in the foundation of reality that threatened to bring the whole structure crashing down. This belief system is the key to understanding the sheer extremity of the punishments that followed. When we think of justice today, we think of deterrence, rehabilitation, or retribution aimed at an individual. But for the Maya, the punishment of a sacred woman had a far greater purpose: to appease the enraged gods and violently restore cosmic order. The punishment had to be as profound as the transgression. It needed to be a spectacle of purification, a public ceremony of pain and terror so absolute that it would cauterize the wound in the fabric of the universe. The accused woman was no longer seen as a person who had made a mistake. She was a vessel of pollution, a source of spiritual contagion that had to be ritually cleansed and purged from the community in the most dramatic way possible. Her suffering was not just a warning to others, it was a necessary sacrifice to save the world from the consequences of her actions. The first punishment we will explore was reserved for a crime the Maya considered among the most heinous imaginable for a sacred woman, a betrayal not just of her vows, but of the very cosmic principle she embodied. It was a punishment that transformed her from a symbol of life and purity into a public monument of agonizing, slow-motion death. A punishment designed not just to kill the body, but to annihilate the soul and erase the very memory of her existence in a display of calculated, methodical horror. Let's delve into the crime itself. For a temple virgin, the ultimate vow was one of celibacy, a promise to remain untouched, her spiritual energy wholly dedicated to the deity she served. The breaking of this vow was called pe'enik, a term that meant more than just a loss of virginity. It signified a deep spiritual stain, a defilement that radiated outward. If a temple virgin was discovered to have engaged in a sexual relationship, it was seen as a profound betrayal. She had, in the Maya worldview, stolen sacred energy that belonged to the gods and given it to a mortal man. This wasn't merely infidelity, it was cosmic theft. The consequences were not abstract. If a drought withered the cornfields, if a plague swept through the city, if an enemy army appeared on the horizon, the blame could easily fall upon the hidden transgression of a sacred woman. Her secret sin was believed to have angered the gods, who in turn withheld their favour from the entire community. Finding and punishing the source of this divine displeasure became a matter of urgent survival. The investigation would be swift and brutal. Rumours, jealous whispers, a missed menstrual cycle. Any of these could trigger an inquiry. The woman would be seized and subjected to examination by elder priestesses, a humiliating public confirmation of her crime. Her lover, if identified, would face his own horrific fate, often being summarily executed. But for the woman, the vessel of the transgression, a simple death was considered too merciful. Her punishment had to be a lesson, a gruesome public theatre of divine justice. This punishment was known as Kuk's Keenum, which translates not just to great pain, but to a living monument of agony. The ceremony would begin at dawn, timed to coincide with the sun's rising, a symbol of renewed order. The condemned woman would be dragged from her cell to the central plaza, the very heart of the city's ceremonial precinct. She would be stripped naked before the assembled crowd, a brutal and immediate act of dehumanization. Her long hair, once carefully styled and adorned as a mark of her sacred status, would be crudely hacked off and burned. She was being systematically unmade, every symbol of her former identity publicly destroyed. She was no longer a priestess, no longer a vessel of the divine, but a blank canvas upon which a terrifying message would be painted. The crowd would not be silent. They would be encouraged to jeer, to scream insults, to throw refuse. This was a crucial part of the ritual. The community's collective condemnation was a necessary force, a wave of social pressure that helped to ritually expel the corruption she represented. Her humiliation was their purification. Then the priests would bring forth the materials. This wasn't stone or wood, but buckets of freshly prepared stucco, a thick, wet mixture of limestone, sand and water, the same material used to coat the gleaming surfaces of their most sacred temples. It was a substance of creation, of holy architecture. Now, it was to become a tool of obliteration. Two high priests, their faces painted with the symbols of judgment, would begin the process. They would start at her feet, methodically applying the wet, heavy plaster, layer by excruciating layer. Imagine the sensation. The initial shock of the cold, wet substance clinging to her skin, the sheer weight of it, pressing down, anchoring her to the spot. As they worked their way up her legs, her ability to move would vanish. She would become a living statue from the ground up, a prisoner in her own hardening shell. The process was deliberately slow, drawn out over hours under the relentless glare of the tropical sun. The priests would chant, their voices rising and falling in a hypnotic rhythm, reciting the laws she had broken, invoking the names of the gods she had offended, and detailing the cosmic chaos her actions had unleashed. Her personal story was erased, replaced by a litany of her sins. As the stucco reached her waist, her torso, her arms, the physical agony would become immense. The weight would make it difficult to breathe. The plaster would begin to dry, contracting as it did, squeezing her body in an unrelenting grip. But the true horror was psychological. Can you imagine the sheer, mind-shattering terror of being slowly encased, of feeling the world close in on you, of seeing your own tomb being built around your living body? The sounds of the crowd would become muffled. Her vision would narrow. Her own breath would become a desperate, rasping struggle against the suffocating weight on her chest. Yet she could not scream, because the priests had a final cruel step. As they reached her neck, a different kind of tool would be brought forward, a hollow reed. They would force it into her mouth, a crude breathing tube, ensuring that her death would not be the swift mercy of suffocation. She was to remain conscious, breathing, and aware for as long as possible. The final layers of stucco would be applied to her head and face, carefully moulded around the breathing tube. Her features, her expressions of terror, would disappear under a blank white mask. She was gone, yet she was still there, a living being, trapped inside an anonymous monument. Her death would take days. She would die of thirst, of exposure, of the sheer exhaustion of her body trying to function under such impossible pressure, and all the while, she would be on public display. Her slow, agonizing demise was the centerpiece of the ritual. People would go about their daily lives, trading in the market, children playing, but always in the shadow of this grotesque spectacle. Her punishment served as a constant, terrifying reminder of the price of transgression. Once she was finally dead, confirmed by the silence from the breathing tube, her body was not removed. The stucco shell, now her sarcophagus, was left in place. It would be painted with symbols of chaos and broken vows, a permanent public marker of divine justice. She became a landmark of fear, a story told to frighten children and chasten young priestesses for generations to come. Her individual identity was annihilated, replaced entirely by the memory of her crime and its horrific consequence. It was a punishment that didn't just end a life, it weaponized it, turning her own body into the ultimate symbol of social and cosmic control. But even this grotesque fate, this slow transformation from human to object, was not the ultimate expression of Maya justice. There were crimes considered even more corrosive to the fabric of reality, betrayals that went beyond the breaking of a personal vow and struck at the very heart of the gods and the state. For such crimes, a punishment was devised that involved not the slow sealing of the body, but its ritualistic, piece-by-piece deconstruction. This brings us to the second punishment, a fate reserved for a sacred woman whose crime was not of the flesh but of the spirit and the bloodline. This punishment was called Zolbix Chi-Ich, the unraveling of the blood, and it was designed for a royal woman, a queen, a princess, a king's sister or mother, who committed an act of treason. Treason in the Maya world was a multi-layered concept. It could mean conspiring to overthrow her husband or son, the king. It could mean collaborating with a rival city-state, leaking military secrets, or undermining a crucial political alliance. But most damningly, it could mean committing adultery, an act that had terrifying dynastic implications. For a royal woman, adultery wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was an act of genetic warfare. Her womb was the sacred vessel of the royal bloodline, which the Maya believed was descended directly from the gods. To introduce foreign blood into this divine lineage was to corrupt the dynasty at its source. It called into question the legitimacy of all future heirs, threatening to sever the king's connection to the divine and plunge the kingdom into a succession crisis. It was a crime against the past, the present and the future, and it demanded a punishment that mirrored this total unraveling of the social and cosmic order. The ceremony of the unraveling would be a grand theatrical production of state power. It would not be held in a simple plaza, but on the highest platform of the city's main pyramid, before the entrance to the most sacred temple. The entire political and religious elite would be in attendance. Lords from allied cities, captive nobles from conquered ones, the kingdom's top military commanders, and the full array of high priests. This was not just for the common people. It was a stark warning to the powerful. The condemned royal woman would be led up the pyramid's steep steps, not in rags but dressed in the full, magnificent regalia of her station. She would wear the jade jewellery, the elaborate headdress of rare quetzal feathers, and the intricately woven robes that signified her royal status. This was a crucial psychological element of the ritual. She was being condemned not as a common criminal, but as the royal personage she was, making her fall from grace all the more dramatic and terrifying. Her identity was being emphasized, not erased, so that its destruction would be all the more profound. At the pyramid's summit, she would be brought before the king himself, who would act as the chief executioner. This was not delegated. The king had to be seen as the ultimate agent of justice, personally purging the corruption from his own bloodline. He would not use a common sacrificial knife of obsidian. Instead, he would wield a ceremonial blade, often one made from razor-sharp flint and adorned with symbols of his divine authority. The punishment began not with a killing blow, but with a series of precise, symbolic cuts. The king would first slice through the jade and gold bracelets on her wrists. He would then use the blade to sever the intricate threads of her ceremonial belt and the golden clasps of her robe. With each cut, he would recite a part of the sacred histories, the genealogies that trace their dynasty back to the gods, the very lineage she had been accused of corrupting. He was, in a very literal sense, cutting her out of the family history. Her royal garments, now shredded, would fall away, leaving her exposed before the silent, watchful eyes of the empire's elite. Then, the physical deconstruction would begin. But this was not a chaotic frenzy of violence. It was a slow, methodical process, a ritualized dissection with deep cosmic symbolism. The king would make the first incision, not on her torso, but on her fingertips and toes. He would systematically sever each digit, one by one. According to Maya belief, the hands and feet were primary points of connection to the world, the tools through which an individual enacted their will. By removing her fingers and toes, he was symbolically and literally disabling her ability to act, to touch, to walk, to have any agency in the mortal realm. Each severed piece would be placed carefully in a ceremonial vessel held by a priest. Next, he would move to her limbs. Her hands, feet, forearms, and lower legs would be disarticulated at the joints. The process would be agonizingly slow, designed to maximize pain and consciousness. The Maya had a sophisticated understanding of anatomy, and the cuts would be made with a chilling precision, meant to dismember without causing immediate death from blood loss. All the while, priests would chant, and the rhythmic, heart-pounding beat of drums would echo across the plaza below, a terrifying soundtrack to the methodical destruction of a human being. The final stage of the unraveling was the most horrific. With the woman still alive, her body now a mutilated torso, the king would perform a mock caesarean section. He would cut open her abdomen and ritually remove her womb, the very source of the perceived corruption. This organ, once seen as the sacred cradle of the dynasty, was now held up to the crowd as a symbol of her treason. It would be placed on a small pyre and burned before her eyes, a final agonizing act of psychological torture. Her potential to create life, the very essence of her role as a royal woman, was turned to ash. Only then, with her body completely dismantled and her symbolic purpose annihilated, would the king grant her the mercy of death, usually by a swift blow to the heart with the flint blade. But her story did not end there. Her dismembered body parts were not buried or cremated together. They were treated as potent objects of political messaging. Her head might be sent to a rebellious vassal state as a warning. Her hands could be displayed on the city gates. The remaining pieces would be scattered, ensuring she could never be whole again, not even in the underworld. Her very soul, it was believed, would be so fragmented that it could never find peace, forever wandering, incomplete. This punishment was the ultimate statement of power, a gruesome demonstration that not even the highest-born woman was above the king's justice, and that the purity of the divine bloodline was a principle for which the most extreme forms of cruelty were not only justified, but necessary. There was, however, one crime so blasphemous that it transcended even treason, a crime that was seen as a direct assault on the gods themselves. For this, the Maya devised their most terrifying punishment, one that sought to erase a person from existence not just in the mortal world, but in the cosmic memory itself. This third and final punishment, the most terrifying in the Maya arsenal, was reserved for the ultimate act of sacrilege, the deliberate desecration of a sacred object, or the impersonation of a deity by an unsanctioned sacred woman. This was called pulbil ka'ak, the casting into the primordial fire. It was a punishment for a crime that was not just against the state or the bloodline, but against the very fabric of divine reality. Imagine a high priestess, an oracle, who, driven by ambition or madness, falsely claims to be the living incarnation of the moon goddess Ikchel. She might mimic the goddess's sacred rituals, issue false prophecies, and demand the worship due only to a true deity. To the Maya, this was not just fraud, it was a cosmic hijacking. She was attempting to steal divine power, to channel the sacred for her own profane purposes. Another form of this crime was the intentional destruction of a revered idol, or the desecration of a temple's inner sanctum. Such an act was seen as a direct attack on the god who resided within that space, an attempt to murder a divinity. This was blasphemy of the highest order, a spiritual insurgency that threatened to sever the connection between the human and divine worlds entirely, inviting an apocalypse. The goal of Pulbil Kaak was not just to kill the offender, but to perform a complete and total ontological erasure. The Maya believed that existence was composed of both a physical body and a spiritual essence, a soul that journeyed to the underworld after death. This punishment was designed to destroy both, to utterly annihilate a person from the cosmic record, leaving not even a ghost or a memory behind. The preparation for this ritual was as symbolic as the act itself. The condemned woman would be isolated for a period of 9 days, corresponding to the 9 levels of the Maya underworld, Xibalba. During this time, she would not be treated as human. She would be referred to only as K'ark Nab, the thing of the abyss. She was fed ashes mixed with water, and her face was painted pitch black, a symbol of the void to which she would be consigned. She was ritually unnamed, her personal name and the names of her ancestors publicly struck from the records and forbidden to be spoken again. Her family line was declared terminated. She was being systematically stripped of every element of her human and social identity, reduced to a non-entity, a piece of living corruption awaiting its final purification. The location of the punishment was of supreme importance. It would not take place in a city plaza or atop a pyramid. The woman would be marched out of the city, far into the jungle, to a place of immense natural and spiritual power, a sacred cenote. Cenotes were natural limestone sinkholes filled with crystal clear groundwater, which the Maya believed were portals to Xibalba, the underworld. They were places of creation and destruction, gateways where the world of the living touched the world of the gods and ancestors. They were where life-giving water was drawn, and where the most precious offerings, gold, jade, and human sacrifices, were made to appease the chthonic deities. But for this ritual, a specific type of cenote was chosen, a dry cave that led deep into the earth, a place believed to be a direct chimney to the primordial fires of creation at the center of the cosmos. This was not a place of water and life, but a direct conduit to the forces of cosmic dissolution. At the edge of this gaping maw in the earth, a massive pyre would have been constructed, not of ordinary wood, but of the sacred copal tree, whose resin was burned as incense, the food of the gods. The pyre was built to burn with an unnatural, otherworldly intensity. The condemned woman, now a nameless, faceless symbol of ultimate blasphemy, would be brought to the edge. There would be no grand speeches, no public jeering. The atmosphere would be one of solemn, terrifying silence, broken only by the low, guttural chants of the highest-ranking priests, who wore masks of jaguar and serpent gods, the divine predators of the underworld. She would not be simply thrown onto the fire. First, her body would be methodically broken. Priests would use obsidian clubs to shatter her kneecaps, her elbows and her shoulders. This was to ensure that her spirit, should any fragment of it survive, would be crippled and unable to crawl back out of the underworld. It was a final act of magical insurance against her spiritual return. Then, bound and broken, she would be ceremonially lifted by 4 priests and cast directly into the heart of the blazing pyre. The copal wood, rich with resin, would ignite with a ferocious roar, consuming her in a blast of white-hot flame and thick aromatic smoke. The priests believed that this was no ordinary fire. It was a fragment of the primordial fire of creation, a fire that did not just burn flesh, but incinerated the soul itself. The smoke that billowed from the cenote was seen as her annihilated essence, returning to the void as a formless, meaningless vapour. The fire would be kept burning for days, fed continuously by the priests until nothing, not even ash, remained. The site would then be ritually sealed, the entrance to the cave covered with massive boulders and marked with glyphs of warning and cosmic negation. It became a permanently cursed place, a dead zone in the spiritual landscape of the Maya world. This was the ultimate punishment because it offered no closure, no chance for the spirit to find peace in the afterlife, no memory to be preserved by the living. It was the complete and total erasure of a human being from time, space, and memory. It was the Maya's attempt to play God, to not just take a life, but to uncreate a soul, a chilling testament to the terrifying depths of their belief system, where the sacred and the savage were inextricably, horrifically intertwined. To understand the true horror of these punishments, we must now turn the lens away from the victim and into the unblinking eyes of the executioners and the roaring mouth of the crowd. What kind of human mind, what kind of collective soul can conceive of, carry out, and celebrate such methodical acts of cruelty? It is a question that cuts to the very heart of the human condition, revealing the terrifying capacity for brutality that lies dormant within the architecture of belief. To witness the Zolbik's Chayich, the unraveling of the blood, was to witness a king not just killing a traitor, but performing a necessary and sacred act of cosmic surgery. Imagine the king, the Kohul Ajor, or Holy Lord, standing atop that pyramid, the flint knife heavy in his hand. He's about to dismember a woman who may be his wife, his sister, his own mother. In our world, this would be an act of monstrous personal rage, but in his, it was the ultimate performance of impersonal, divine duty. He could not afford to see her as human. In the days leading up to the ceremony, the priests would have prepared him, not just physically, but spiritually. Through fasting, prayer, and hallucinogenic rituals, he would have been guided to a state of consciousness where he was no longer just a man, but the living incarnation of the jaguar god of the underworld, the great destroyer, the agent of divine judgment. The woman before him would have been transformed in his mind into a symbol of chaos, the principle of chaos and decay. She was a cancer in the divine bloodline, and he was the surgeon tasked with excising it to save the life of the kingdom. Every cut he made was not an act of violence, but a sacred glyph being carved into the flesh of a heretic. The severing of her fingers was not mutilation. It was the silencing of her earthly agency. The removal of her womb was not butchery. It was the purification of the dynasty. He would have to believe this with every fibre of his being, because the alternative, the recognition that he was methodically torturing and killing a member of his own family, was a truth too psychologically catastrophic to bear. His face, likely painted or masked, was not just for ceremony. It was a shield for his humanity, allowing the god within to perform its terrible work without being shattered by human empathy. Now consider the priests, the men applying the wet stucco in the punishment of Kuksk Inam. They were not fueled by rage or a lust for power. They were something far more chilling. They were technicians of the sacred. Their actions were dictated by ancient protocols, a divine script that had been followed for generations. For them, the screaming, struggling woman at their feet had already ceased to be a person. She was a ritual problem that required a ritual solution. Their movements would be precise, unhurried, and imbued with a sense of profound purpose. As they chanted the litanies of her sins, they were not just condemning her, they were recalibrating the universe. Each layer of plaster was a prayer, a physical manifestation of the community's desire for order. They would have felt the grim satisfaction of a craftsman completing a difficult but necessary task. They were building a monument, not destroying a life. The breathing reed they inserted into her mouth was not an act of prolonged torture in their eyes. It was a technical requirement of the ritual, ensuring that the sacrifice remained living for the prescribed duration to maximize its efficacy as an offering to the gods. This cold procedural detachment is perhaps more terrifying than any passionate cruelty. It is the logic of the fanatic, the mindset that can justify any atrocity in the name of a higher cause. And what of the thousands gathered in the plaza below? What did they feel as they watched a young woman slowly suffocated in a tomb of her own making? The answer is a complex and disturbing cocktail of emotions. Firstly, there was catharsis. The Maya world was one of perpetual anxiety. The rains might fail, the crops could wither, a neighbouring city might attack. In a world governed by capricious gods, these events were not random. They were signs of divine displeasure. The public execution of a sacred woman provided a focal point for all this free-floating fear and anxiety. She became the scapegoat, the single identifiable cause of all their troubles. Every jeer they shouted, every piece of refuse they threw, was an act of purging their own fear. Her suffering became their collective relief. Her death a promise that the gods had been appeased and that order would be restored. Secondly, there was the powerful element of fear as social control. The spectacle was a lesson etched not in stone, but in raw human terror. Every child who witnessed it, every woman who heard the story, received an unforgettable message about the absolute power of the gods and the state, and the catastrophic consequences of transgression. It reinforced the rigid social hierarchy and created a powerful incentive for conformity. But we cannot ignore a darker, more universal human impulse: the morbid fascination with spectacle. In a society without other forms of mass entertainment, a public ritual of this magnitude was a mesmerizing event. It was high drama, a real-life horror show that engaged the senses and emotions in a way nothing else could. The rhythmic chanting, the beat of the drums, the bright colours of the priestly vestments, all set against the backdrop of a slow, agonizing death. It was a powerful, intoxicating, and deeply disturbing form of theatre. The crowd was not just a collection of passive observers, they were active participants, their emotional energy feeding the ritual, their presence validating the act. They were bound together in a shared experience of righteous violence, a communal bond forged in the crucible of another's agony. This is the ultimate psychology that underpins these punishments, a process of radical dehumanization. The woman at the center of the ritual had to be stripped of her humanity in the eyes of everyone involved. For the king, she was a symbol of chaos. For the priests, a ritual object. For the crowd, a scapegoat for their fears. It was only by transforming her from a who into a what that they could perform and endure these acts without seeing themselves as monsters. The true tragedy is not just that a woman was killed, but that an entire society conspired to forget she was ever human in the first place, all in the desperate, terrifying pursuit of cosmic order. Now let's step out of the plaza and into the silent, echoing halls of history to ask a question that haunts the study of any ancient civilization. How do we truly know all of this? The chilling details of these punishments are not the fanciful inventions of a modern storyteller. They are the fragmented whispers that have survived the ravages of time, pieced together from a mosaic of archaeological evidence, cryptic hieroglyphs, and the biased, often horrified, accounts of their Spanish conquerors. Reconstructing these rituals is like assembling a ghost from dust and echoes, a process fraught with both discovery and the danger of misinterpretation. One of the most powerful sources comes from the codices, the incredible folding bark books created by Maya scribes. Though the Spanish bishop Diego de Landa infamously burned hundreds of these priceless records in a single catastrophic act of cultural vandalism, a precious few survived. In the Dresden Codex and the Madrid Codex, we find not explicit descriptions of punishments, but ritual almanacs and iconographic scenes that depict the cosmic principles of order and chaos. These texts show goddesses of creation and destruction, scenes of sacrifice, and the complex relationship between rulers and deities. When we see a glyph representing Pe'enik, that spiritual stain of a broken vow, next to an image of a bound female figure, we are not seeing a direct narrative, but a piece of a much larger puzzle. The glyphs provide the vocabulary of the crime. The iconography hints at the consequence. It is the work of epigraphers, scholars who have dedicated their lives to cracking the Maya code to connect these symbolic dots. They can tell us that a certain combination of symbols refers to the severing of a divine lineage, while another refers to the appeasement of a wrathful god. These are the linguistic clues that allow us to build a framework for understanding the why behind the brutality, even if the how remains tantalizingly out of direct view in these specific texts. Archaeology provides the grim physical corroboration. In and around sacred sites, particularly cenotes like the famous sacred cenote at Chichen Itza, the bones of sacrificial victims tell their own silent stories. Forensic analysis of these remains can reveal the age and sex of the individual, and often the manner of their death, a skeleton found with joints systematically disarticulated is no longer just a collection of bones. It is a potential victim of a ritual like the unraveling of the blood. The discovery of a young female skeleton, with evidence of broken limbs, found in a context of high ritual significance, lends physical weight to the concept of a punishment designed to cripple a spirit before its final journey. The location of these remains is just as crucial. A body found at the bottom of a cenote, surrounded by offerings of jade and gold, was clearly a ritual sacrifice. One found hastily buried or scattered near a city's edge suggests a different kind of end. An execution, a purging of a polluted individual. The very earth becomes a text, and the archaeologist, a reader of bones and stones. Then we have the art, the stunningly detailed murals and carved stone stelae that adorned Maya temples and palaces. At sites like Bonampak, vibrant murals depict scenes of courtly life, but also graphic scenes of war, torture, and the ritual humiliation of captives. We see lords, their faces impassive, presiding over the agony of others. While these often depict male captives of war, they provide an invaluable window into the Maya acceptance of ritualized violence as a legitimate tool of statecraft and religion. The artistic conventions, the way a bound figure is portrayed, the symbols of power wielded by the ruler, give us a visual language. When we see a female figure in a similar pose of submission or agony on a smaller carved object, we can infer that she is subject to the same ideological forces. The stelae, massive stone monuments celebrating the reigns of kings, often list their parentage, emphasizing the purity of their bloodline. When a queen's name is suddenly and deliberately carved out of a dynastic record, it is a form of historical erasure, a damnatio memoria that powerfully echoes the social and spiritual annihilation described in the punishments. Finally, we must consider the controversial but essential accounts of the Spanish. Men like Diego de Landa, while responsible for destroying so much, also wrote detailed accounts of the Maya society they were in the process of dismantling. His work, Relación de las Cosas de Yucatán, is a foundational text. It is, of course, deeply flawed, written through the lens of a 16th century Catholic friar who saw the Maya practices as demonic paganism. He often exaggerated or misunderstood the nuances of the rituals he described. Yet buried within his condemnation are invaluable ethnographic details. He writes of their belief in a spiritual essence, their terror of divine wrath, and their practice of human sacrifice. He describes punishments for adultery and other social crimes. While we must read his work with a critical eye, stripping away the layers of colonial bias, his observations provide a bridge between the symbolic world of the glyphs and the physical reality of the bones. He gives us an outsider's glimpse into the living, breathing society that performed these acts. By weaving these disparate threads together, the sacred symbols of the codices, the silent testimony of the bones, the public declarations of the stone monuments, and the filtered observations of the conquerors, a chillingly coherent picture begins to emerge. It is a picture of a society so deeply invested in its vision of cosmic order that it could justify, codify, and ritualize acts of unimaginable cruelty, transforming human women into symbols, sacrifices, and terrifying warnings. The evidence is fragmented, but the echo of their screams is unmistakable. And so we are left with the evidence. The bones in the cenote, the silent glyphs on the stone, the whispers of the conquerors, and the haunting iconography of a world consumed by its own cosmic anxieties. We have reconstructed the punishments, detailed the rituals, and peered into the chilling psychology that made it all possible. But what is the legacy of such terror? What is the final, enduring truth that echoes from these ancient acts of ritualized violence? It is the staggering paradox of the Maya themselves. This was not a primitive culture, lashing out in a frenzy of mindless savagery. This was the civilization that developed one of the most sophisticated writing systems in the ancient world, a people who independently conceived of the number zero, allowing for breathtaking mathematical calculations. They were astronomers of unparalleled genius, capable of tracking the movements of Venus with an accuracy that would not be surpassed until the 20th century. Their cities were architectural marvels, their art a thing of sublime beauty and complexity. This is the civilization that could map the heavens, and yet could also meticulously plan the step-by-step psychological and physical disassembly of a human being. They could build pyramids that touch the sky, and also build a living tomb of stucco around a terrified young woman. This is the truth that should make our blood run cold. The capacity for this kind of methodical cruelty was not born from ignorance, but existed alongside, and was perhaps even fueled by a profound and complex intellectual and spiritual framework. It tells us that civilization and savagery are not opposites. They are terrifyingly compatible. Two sides of the same human coin. The same mind that can conceive of cosmic order can also justify the most horrific acts to maintain it. The same society that elevates women to the status of goddesses can, with a chillingly short turn of logic, condemn them to the status of sacrificial objects. The line between reverence and revulsion, between the sacred and the profane, is not a wall. It is a razor's edge. This is not, therefore, merely a story about the ancient Maya. It is a story about us. It is a dark mirror held up to the human capacity for belief. Every culture, in every era, has its own non-negotiable truths, its own sacred principles for which it is willing to kill. The gods may change, the ideologies may shift, but the underlying mechanism remains terrifyingly consistent. It is the mechanism of dehumanization. To cast a woman into the primordial fire, you must first convince yourself that she is not a woman, but a cosmic stain. To unravel her body, piece by piece, you must first see her not as a relative, but as a corruption in the blood. To entomb her alive, you must see her not as a person, but as a monument to a broken law. Once you have made that mental leap, once you have successfully transformed a human being into an idea, a symbol, or a threat, there is no limit to the cruelty that can be justified. It is the same cold logic that fueled the Spanish Inquisition, the witch trials of Salem, and the gas chambers of the Holocaust. The scale and the context change, but the foundational act of stripping a person of their humanity to serve a higher purpose is a poison that runs through the veins of human history. When we look at the ruins of Tikal or Palenque today, reclaimed by the suffocating green embrace of the jungle, we should see more than just fallen stones. We should see the ghost of a system that demanded an impossible price for its own preservation. Where are the gods who demanded this blood now? Where is the cosmic order that was paid for with such agony? It has been swallowed by time, just like the empires and ideologies that followed it. The punishments for all their spectacular horror ultimately failed. They could not stave off the droughts, the wars, the internal strife, and the eventual mysterious collapse of the classic Maya civilization. Terror is a powerful tool of control, but it is a brittle one. A society built on a foundation of ritualized fear is a society that is, in the end, at war with itself. The silence that now hangs over these great dead cities is the final verdict. And so, we are left with her, the unnamed woman, the temple virgin, the royal queen, the oracle. Before she was a vessel of the divine, or a symbol of corruption, or a public spectacle of pain, she was a person. She had a name that her mother whispered to her. She had hopes that were her own. She felt the warmth of the sun on her skin and the coolness of the evening rain. She may have loved and dreamed and feared, just as we do. All of that was erased, systematically and deliberately, in the name of the gods and the state. Her humanity was the first thing to be sacrificed, long before the knife ever fell, or the first handful of stucco was applied. Perhaps the most meaningful act we can perform across the vast, silent gulf of 2,000 years is to simply remember that, to look past the grotesque theatre of the punishment and see the real human tragedy at its heart, to restore, in our own minds, the humanity that was so brutally taken from her. The story of the sacred women of the Maya is a chilling journey into the darkness of the past, but its most important lesson is a timeless and urgent warning. It reminds us that the most dangerous threat to our humanity is not the monster that lurks in the shadows, but the one that convinces us to see our fellow human beings as anything less than human. It is the warning that the line between the sacred and the savage is terrifyingly thin, and is always drawn in blood.